Hey everyone, Canadian Renegade again. I'm going to continue my series of talks on firearm laws in Canada. Today what I want to discuss is when anti-gunners make the argument, you don't need a gun for that, or nobody needs a gun for that. A lot of times when I actually think about it, it's like, yeah, maybe I don't need a gun for that, but the reason why I don't use a gun for that is because you won't let me, not because you couldn't use a gun for that. So I'm just going to use a few examples to discuss the issue. So one of the things we hear a lot of times is nobody needs a handgun for hunting, right? And it's like, well, that's true. You don't need a handgun for hunting, but the reason why in Canada we don't use handguns for hunting is because we're not allowed. And if you're going to use the argument, well, you don't need it, it's like, well, you don't need a rifle for hunting either. You could use a bow and arrow. You don't need a bow and arrow for hunting. You could use a spear. In fact, I've seen guys on YouTube, I've seen at least one person on YouTube spear an elk. The guy snuck up to an elk within about probably 50 feet, and he threw a spear and he killed the elk. So you don't need a gun to kill a deer or an elk or a moose. You could use primitive weapons. And it's like, well, it's the same with vehicles. You don't, I've got a minivan. I don't need a minivan with 280 horsepower. I could have a minivan with, I think they used to have like 200 horsepower. I drove a Cavalier when I was just starting to drive. I think it had 100 horsepower. Or just over anyways. It's totally gutless. So you don't need that much power. Why do you need a Corvette? You don't need that much power to drive. Or even an electric vehicle like a Tesla. You don't need to be able to do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. You're gonna kill somebody. Anyways, I'm being a little bit facetious here. But yeah, that argument, it kind of never ends, right? But anyways, in Canada, back to the handgun topic, like, we don't hunt in Canada with handguns because we're not allowed. Now, part of the issue there is part of the gun community are what some of us refer to as fuds. So when we say fuds, if you're not familiar with that term, it's kind of a reference to Elmer Fudd. It's basically like your typical older hunting person that they don't think that you need a handgun or you need some sort of sporting rifle for target shooting or whatever your use. They don't think that you need it because they're basically just into hunting traditionally with bolt action rifles and shotguns and things like that. So, they would probably say, well, you shouldn't be hunting deer with a handgun anyways because, it's underpowered. You should be using a rifle. And it's like, okay, well, I get your point, but people successfully hunt deer with a bow and arrow and a 44 Magnum Ruger Blackhawk is a lot more powerful than a bow and arrow. And people successfully hunt deer, elk, and moose with handguns in the States. So it's just more of a challenge. You just have to get close and you have to have good shot placement, just like with a bow and arrow or a crossbow. So anyways, yeah, like the FUDs, the reason why I bring them up is that as a gun community, we should all be supporting each other, right? And not saying, just because I don't want to do that, you shouldn't be allowed to do that too, or you don't need to be allowed to do that. I honestly think that if I could hunt deer with a handgun, if that was completely legal, I'd probably at least try it. I think it'd be a great challenge. And I think there's a lot of other people that would enjoy it. Maybe there's somebody who has some sort of physical condition, maybe like a shoulder problem. Maybe they can't draw a bow, but maybe they want a really hard challenge to get a deer. But maybe they could shoot a handgun. Maybe that doesn't affect their shoulder the same way. So, yeah, you don't need a handgun, or you shouldn't have a handgun for hunting, but the only reason why we don't use a handgun here in Canada is because we're not allowed to use a handgun, okay? So to me, that's basically a non-argument. The same can be said for, an AR-15. Nobody needs an AR-15 to hunt. And it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with an AR-15 for hunting. Now, part of the problem is it's a .22 caliber most of the time. So And I think the reason, the hunting regulations, current hunting regulations, they do not allow 22 caliber ammunition to be used on big game. Now, I think that the reason why that was implemented is, one, I think people might have been using 22 long rifles on game or 22 magnums on game, so that eliminates those. And then if you go back like 50 or 60 years, the 223 ammunition and 5.56 ammunition, they were generally lighter full metal jacket projectiles, or they were really light, like almost like a varmint grenade type of round, where they were made for varmints, so they would basically almost explode on impact, and they didn't have very good penetration. So deer were being wounded by full metal jacket bullets, or by bullets that were almost like over expanding. But nowadays with modern, well, first of all, let's talk a little bit more caliber talk. There are cartridges out there now, like I think there's a 22 ARC, there's a 22 Creedmoor. There's always been, like, I think the 220 Swift, right? And with the more modern bullets that they have now, these are like heavy 4 caliber bullets. They'd be like 70 grains, 77 grains, like maybe like a Partition style or a Barnes X style bullet at 70 grains. That's more than enough for a deer. And I know that some people are going to debate me on that or think otherwise, but if you can shoot a deer with a bow and arrow, you're telling me you can't shoot a deer with a 77 grain projectile out of a 223 or a 5.56 NATO? I mean, it's more than enough power. It's more powerful than that 44 Magnum handgun, at least in terms of foot-pounds of energy. Once again, it comes down to limiting your range. So you probably shouldn't be shooting a 22 caliber at a deer at, let's say, 400 yards, but at like 150 yards with good shot placement, there's no problem there. And they do it all the time in the United States. It's good for smaller framed people or children, like youths, I guess. Like, I think you have to be like 12 to hunt in Canada or something like that. So, if you had a 12-year-old girl who wanted to go shoot a deer, but she's recoil sensitive, well, you could give her an AR-15 with the right rifle twist and the right projectile. There's nothing wrong with that. It's acceptable. And but the reason why we don't use AR-15s is, even before the long gun ban, like the semi-auto bans, they were restricted firearms. You weren't allowed to take them hunting, and they're mostly 22 caliber. Now, that said, if the 22 caliber is your hang up on that, you can chamber AR-15s in other calibers, like 6.5 Grendel, 350 Legend, 300 Blackout. 350 Legend is a great deer cartridge, and as far as I know, I think it uses the same lower and the same magazines as 5.56 NATO. Pretty sure. I could be wrong. If I am, correct me in the comments. But yeah, 350 Legend is a great deer cartridge. It's very similar in power level to 30-30. And so once again, it's like, you're probably not going to shoot a deer with that at, over 200 yards, but within 200 yards is very capable. And that would allow you to take something like an AR-15 or an AR-180 and, take it out to the field and actually go harvest game with it. I don't see a problem with that. The last thing I want to talk about, where we could in Canada but we're not allowed to, is self-defense. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard Justin Trudeau say, we don't use guns for self-defense in Canada. That's not something that we do. Like we're too civilized for that or something. Meanwhile, home invasions are at record levels, assaults, gun crime is just through the roof in the last several years. But we don't use guns here in Canada for self-defense. And once again, it's like, it's just because you won't let us, guys. Okay, it's not because it's not a good idea. I think it's completely an acceptable thing to do, especially for vulnerable people, vulnerable groups. You can make a case that somebody like me, right? You could kind of make a case, well, you don't need a gun for self-defense. You're, a fairly strong middle-aged guy. you can handle yourself, right? But what if I was a 100-pound woman living alone? Shouldn't she be able to defend herself? A guy could just force his way into her house and have his way with her. She might not even be able to dial 911. If he started hitting her as soon as he got in the door, that might be it, right? So why shouldn't she be allowed to defend herself? Like, are you against self-defense? Because it's pretty hypocritical to say you have a right to self-defense, but not with a gun. We're not going to let you use the most useful tool for self-defense, right? And every day we see criminals invading homes with firearms, even in Canada. Canada seems to be getting almost as bad as a lot of parts of the United States now, even though we've got all this gun control. It's supposed to keep us safe. But we see every day criminals using guns to victimize people, and we're basically still being told you don't need a gun for self-defense. And it's garbage. And I think it needs to change. And what I would say to that is like, how would you implement that? Well, it would be simple. Okay, we already have concealed carry in Canada. There actually is a permit for it already. The only problem is they don't give it to anybody, right? So if you're that example of like that small woman, let's say you were a small woman, you're living alone, you've had threats made against you, and you live in a rough neighborhood, and you don't even drive, okay? So let's see all those things. If you applied for a concealed carry weapon in Canada, like that's the perfect candidate for concealed carry weapon, in my opinion, you would get denied. The only people that they're giving these permits to are like politicians, media people, or like movie stars and stuff like that, and like billionaires, pretty much. Like that's who's or like private security. That's who's getting those permits. Okay. People like you and me, apparently we're not important enough that our lives don't matter. But anyways, how you would implement a concealed carry weapons program in Canada would be very simple. First of all, you'd have to have a PAL. So that means you've already had a criminal record check. You've already had I guess it'd be like a character witness, like they've interviewed people about your character. You can't have a criminal record. They talk to your spouse, make sure that he or she or whoever it is feels comfortable with you having guns. And if you pass through like all those hoops, then you can get a PAL. So you're already pretty much one of the safest subgroups of people in the entire country, if not the safest subgroups in the entire country. So then all you do is add on top of that a use of force course and test. So that would be like a 1 or 2 day course where they teach you like when it is okay to use a firearm in self-defense and when it's not. And there's a lot of minutia around that, of course. I've actually taken one of those like 20 years ago or so. I worked for, it was SecureCorps at the time. I think they were bought out by G4S. It might even be a different company now, but I was an armored car guard, and I had to take, is essentially what I was told was it was very similar, if not the same course that the police were taking. And yeah, I think it was like a 2 day course or something like that. And we did like use of force training, and then we did basically like an accuracy test. So yeah, there'd be a written test to make sure you know when you can and can't use your gun. And then there would be an accuracy test to make sure you don't accidentally shoot somebody you're not supposed to, because you just can't aim under pressure. Usually it's like timed, and there's different distances you shoot at. And then if you pass that, then what's the problem? I mean, police have guns, armored car has guns. If you can pass the test, I don't see what the problem is. And there's a lot of people who I think could really use concealed carry now, and I think it would actually deter crime. So I guess that's all for today. Basically, there's a lot of things we should be allowed to do with guns that we could do with guns, but they won't let us.